Hi, everyone. On behalf of Gutman Library, I'd like to welcome you to today's important book talk, Equity and Quality in Digital Learning, Realizing the Promise in K-12 Education. We have all three authors with us this afternoon. Carolyn Heinrich, Professor of Public Policy, Education, and Economics at Vanderbilt University. Jennifer Darling-Aduana, Assistant Professor of Learning Technologies at Georgia State University. And Annalee Good, Assistant Scientist at Wisconsin Center for Education Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Education. Before we start, I would like to let you know that chat is currently disabled, so we can collect all questions in the Q&A feature, which the authors will address later this hour. Carolyn, you can take it from here. Let me just designate you the host.
All right, hello everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. I think I still need to have that transfer.
Yes.
Okay. We're ready now. Okay, here we go. Okay. So as was just introduced, we're going to be talking today about our book, Equity and Quality in Digital Learning, Realizing the Promise in K-12 Education. This study is based on more than 6 years of work across 2 school districts. We were already introduced the 3 authors. So myself, I'm Carolyn. You'll hear from Jennifer and Annalee as well today. The work that we did over 6 years was in partnership with 2 different school districts, Dallas Independent School District and Milwaukee Public Schools. And we've actually been in active research partnerships with these districts for more than a decade, both of them. And as you can see, our collaborations extend across our universities, Vanderbilt, the Wisconsin Education Collaborative, where Annalee is. I was formerly at the Center for Health and Social Policy at the University of Texas at Austin, and of course our district partners. And we're sharing here just our link to our website because there is a lot more information there. We make publicly available our research methods and materials that we use, instrumentation we developed in this study, and there's also a link to many other of our research products and publications, and these include also short research briefs. So for those of you who may be practitioners and want quick information on different aspects of what we've learned in our study, that's available for you as well. And so I just want to say just a little bit, I'm going to hand it over to Annalee. In this study, we were very much focused on equity, as we mentioned, and quality in digital learning. And across the districts, we studied a range of different tools at all K-12 grade levels. And so this includes online platforms for course taking, tablets and computers in which there may be applications, some of them that may rely entirely on online instruction, some blended instruction. And as I mentioned, across from primary to the high school level. So we'll be giving you an idea of what we studied today, some of the things that we learned, and also just point out those 3 axes of equity that we focused on. Who is directed to using these digital tools? So certainly there are questions of some underserved groups, students of color, who may be disproportionately using digital instruction for more of their and to meet more of their instructional needs. Also, how is it implemented? And as we all know, we're experiencing this at all levels of education these days, that there can be inequities in how it's implemented. And then we also look at the content in this study. So I'm going to hand it over to Annalee, and Annalee, you can let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for us to be in conversation with you all about our work. Part of setting the context for our work is to look closely at the context and to look at these central drivers behind what we've seen as a dramatic rise in the use of digital tools in K-12 schooling. So the first of these drivers are investments from federal, state, local levels in the digital infrastructure itself, whether that's broadband internet access or district-wide one-to-one device initiatives where every student gets a Chromebook or gets a tablet. Second, the private vendors developing and marketing ed tech products to schools have not only benefited from these public investments in infrastructure, but also from legislation such as the No Child Left Behind Act of 2002, which increased the role of market-based mechanisms and therefore the private sector and their role in public ed. Third, a more recent push for efforts such as personalized learning as a classroom approach, but also often as a whole school model. An approach like personalized learning, more often than not, it depends on digital devices for the types of implementation that it sets out for. Fourth, decreasing budgets for K-12 education can also set the stage for increased use of digital devices. For example, when class sizes increase, teachers may rely more and more on digital devices to then provide instruction and provide supplementary instruction. Similarly, the use of digital tools often increase as mechanisms for test prep as the accountability pressures placed on schools increase. So lastly, we see the COVID-19 pandemic as a major driver of the use of digital tools. Now, what we studied and what's in the book was the integration of digital tools in K-12 classrooms. What we have with COVID is really crisis schooling, which in many cases draws on digital tools out of sheer necessity, not necessarily because it's what might be the best fit for students' needs or contexts. Classroom teachers are under tremendous stress with this last piece. We cannot emphasize this enough. And this should play a huge part in how decisions are made on local, state, and national levels. Of course, all of these drivers overlap and interact with one another. They're not isolated. And they play out most importantly in the classroom. Next slide. The following excerpt is from field notes while we were observing a high school student working in an online course in a computer lab. The teacher was checking in, greeting the students, answering phones, answering doors, making sure students were working in the online instructional program instead of checking their cell phones. The teacher stopped by a couple times to check the progress of this student. When the student got up to ask the teacher to review the quiz, the teacher told him to go back and review it. The student came back to the computer, looked at the notes again, toggled between problems, fiddled with his paper. He stayed on the same problem for 5 minutes, possibly waiting for the teacher to check it again. The teacher came over and asked him if he needed a check, which the student said he did. Then the teacher came over and told the student which problems to fix. He then submitted the quiz and went on to the next part of the course. Of course, the nature of the relationship between teacher and student is quite different in classrooms with heavy use of digital tools, especially when the digital tool has taken on the role of primary instructor, such as this example that I just read. And we should note that the same is true in the impact on student-to-student relationships. We didn't have an explicit focus on this, but we hope to in some of our future work. Across the different district and classroom contexts, we captured some interesting things about these relationships. For example, differences in how time is allocated for different types of tasks, or how data is used with students. And then importantly, how teachers and students create a sense of belonging and community in a classroom that's primarily driven by a digital tool. And we of course see this last point as incredibly relevant in the types of virtual learning that many districts have gone to because of COVID. And then the role of the teacher can be quite different. We mapped a common set of roles for teachers in integrating digital tools in their classrooms. And these included, first, completing administrative responsibilities, like managing the program platform itself, enrolling, such as things like enrollment, troubleshooting, logging in problems, etc. And Carolyn, if you could hit the advanced just, and then one more, thank you. And then secondly, teachers are also providing technical support and supporting the actual instructional environment. So you can imagine the audio is not working, headsets aren't working, internet connections are bad. We literally talked to many different teachers who had to purchase earbuds and headsets for their entire classroom because students were coming in without them, and that was necessary to actually facilitate the instruction itself. Teachers are also monitoring and having to redirect student behavior just to keep the technology users on task. They're supporting student engagement and learning by motivating them across lots of different ways, also having to build relationships, and in some cases, as teachers do, serving as a counselor, serving as a resource coordinator, all these different roles that teachers tend to play in classrooms that now, when there's a digital device driving the instruction, might shift. They're using software to monitor and assess student progress and their actual knowledge and skill base within the digital platform. And then, of course, they're providing instructional support. They're including whether that's direct or blended instruction, whether it's assistance with the actual content, whether they're trying to differentiate instruction across different users. So next, Carolyn is going to dive deeper into our examination of learning and outcomes then within these classrooms.
Hey, thank you so much, Annalee, for giving us a start. So one of the things I'm going to show here is the pathways by which the various pathways we studied by which digital learning affects student educational outcomes. So as you can see in this kind of logic model or graphic, these are the various factors that we studied across our school districts. So as Annalee was just mentioning, oftentimes there are aspects of the classroom environment, the physical environment, its structure, how good is the internet access, that affect how those devices are used. Now, of course, in the time of COVID, this has changed because teachers have much less control of what that environment that the students are studying or using the tools are. And then, of course, supports for technology integration, the teacher's own experience, ability to troubleshoot issues that come up, how much classroom and tech support is available. Even those of us working on campuses where we have we take for granted campus-based staff. We often saw that there was not school campus-based staff to help teachers troubleshoot things. And now you can imagine with the pandemic how, of course, this is affecting things at the home front. So those are some of the factors that go into how the digital tools are used. So some of those things will transfer, of course, to how teachers or others who are going to be supporting students in using tools, their beliefs that it's effective and their ability to engage the students with it. And then, of course, will affect how intensely the students use them, whether they can unleash the capabilities of those tools, and then how engaged the students are. There's student characteristics themselves that factor in. So all these things come together in how well technology is integrated into the classroom and into instruction. We've seen important factors like being able to have blended instruction, live instructor engagement, ability of the teachers to not only monitor students' use, but actually provide support for content learning varied a lot across the tools and the classrooms that we saw. And of course, we list some of the outcomes that we studied empirically, looking at students' performance in school, both their grades, tests, and accumulation of credits in high school and a lot. So I'm just going to show you a couple examples to highlight some findings. We had a number of findings across the two study districts and the various tools that we used. So here's an example of how the loss of instructional time due to technology problems impacts student engagement and learning. And so in this particular analysis we were doing, we were looking at students' use of tablets in Dallas Independent School District. And what you see in these graphs, so we have predicted math and reading test scores associated with how much the percent time in a given classroom session that was lost to technology issues. And what they basically show is, we lose about a quarter to a third of instructional time just troubleshooting tech problems. It quickly impacts student learning. So immediately goes down, and then the more time you lose, of course, the real impact it has on students' scores. Now, one of the things we learned, going back to the model I just showed you, is that clearly if teachers have more training facility, they can troubleshoot those issues more quickly. They might have a student tech leader in the classroom that they employ to help them, and they can help limit that. But some things were simply out of their control, right? If it's an internet issue. And so again, parents, do have reasons to be concerned when they are now in the home trying to help their children learn on devices, and they may not have the training capacities to help manage these types of issues. The real impact for learning loss is real. Another way that we studied this empirically is, so with one particular program was an online course-taking program for high school students. And with this particular program, students would, typically after they failed a course in high school in the traditional classroom, would be directed to take the course online to make it up or complete it. And so we had from the technology vendor, and it's a vendor that uses, that this system is used in all 50 states and in 8 of the 10 largest school districts in the country, primarily at the high school, but also sometimes middle school level. What we did is we took, essentially, 10 million observations and put them into analysis to try to construct different types of users of these tools, recognizing that some kids might get, more out of these online courses than others, and that might be reflected in their behavior, the supports they have, their preparation, who's in the classroom with them. So we took those data and empirically analyzed them to construct kind of typologies of users. So for example, we had some users that just weren't making much progress, completing very few activities in a day, a lot of idle time in the system, which we could observe empirically. And then there were others who were also not, making much progress. We called them the incompatible users because these were students who just weren't prepared for this. They either did not have basic math or reading skills to be taking courses at the level that were in the course system, or they just didn't have the self-regulation. They were younger students. We also defined a group that was more engaged and that got more out of the system. They completed more activities per day with less time, and then were able to complete courses and actually get those credits recovered. And then we also identified another group we called the Moonlighters, and we described them as Moonlighters because they were doing a large share of their learning in the system outside the school day. And what we saw is this also to be a more advantaged group. Not surprisingly, they needed to have that technology, the consistent connection, to be able to succeed. So one more graphic I want to show you is how the intensity of use of this online course taking system impacted academic outcomes. Now, for most of our students in the district, most of them tended to take 1 or 2 online courses that they needed to complete for, often core courses. So about 60% of them were doing 1 to 2 online courses in 1 to 2 of their high school years, so often at the end to make that up. And they did seem to do better. However, there was a group of students, so 13% of them took courses in 3 or more years of high school, so on the latter 2 bars in this particular graph, and they had particular characteristics which we modeled. So they were more likely to be economically disadvantaged, to be English language learners, to have been suspended. They had lower GPAs and fewer credits. So they were using it more intensively because they were struggling more academically. And unfortunately, what we did here was we looked at their outcomes, credits earned, math and reading test scores, and grade point average. And what you see is, through, fairly sophisticated analysis, we disentangled the characteristics of the users, the courses they were taking, and how much time. And you can see that the more course taking they took, there were actually negative and statistically significant impacts. So the dots on those bars show statistically significant negative impacts of using this system on their, their achievement as we measure it by reading math test scores, as well as just grade point average and credits earned. So what this shows you is that even systems like this, with the intent to help students, complete high school, get the credits they need, can have negative effects if the implementation isn't there in a way that facilitates their learning. And I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer, but one of the things I want to say is, through hundreds of observations of classrooms where this was used, we saw that students were, for example, often likely to disengage without, more active teacher engagement. There were teachers in the classroom who couldn't, address the content needs and questions, assistance that the students had required in order to progress in their classes, and then simply, the students themselves would become disengaged or use the system for other things. And Annalee gave some examples of that in her part of the discussion.
All right, so because all of our data collection and analysis occurred pre-COVID, we also wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss with you what we see to be some of the major implications that might be relevant to the current state of education. And so if you don't mind just very slowly, Carolyn, pressing, yeah, thank you. So the recent crisis-driven shift to virtual learning has exacerbated many challenges that school districts face in delivering equitable online education. And so here are just a few of the news articles highlighting those inequities. As you've seen, they include not just disparities in access to digital devices and the internet, but they extend to healthcare, childcare, and economic security. And so a strong, clear focus on equity in managing the transition to digital learning is imperative to prevent the education system from magnifying some of these same inequities. So based on our research, we strongly believe that culturally relevant pedagogy can make a critical difference for fighting educational inequities in virtual learning. And that's particularly in the current crisis-driven learning context, as all of those societal inequities are being magnified. So research has shown that students of all cultural backgrounds learn best when they're provided, and Carolyn, you can go back one slide if that's okay. When students are provided high quality academic experiences that reflect, value, and build upon their home and community lives, and then opportunities to develop socio-political awareness and skills to address the societal inequities that we're all facing and becoming aware of day in and day out. And so challenges to enacting this type of culturally relevant pedagogy virtually, specifically, include fewer opportunities for direct interactions with teachers and their peers due to more limited synchronous instructional time. And as Annalee mentioned before, an often very heavy reliance on third-party vendors for developing not just instructional delivery processes, but also the course content itself. So if you want to go to the next slide, Carolyn. So we've come together and worked with our partners and with some of the online course vendors that we've been working through this research process, and have come to develop a few steps that we see as essential to enacting this type of culturally relevant pedagogy virtually. So if you could press one more time. So we see great potential in these unprecedented times to partner with students, families, and educators. And the first step to this is for educators, families, and research partners to observe, document, and evaluate the quality of digital tools and platforms. So many digital resources, as we know, are being used for the first time in schools, or they're being used at such a larger scale than they were originally intended. So when we were working with the district to review online courses for cultural relevance, we identified patterns of insensitive statements and a clear Eurocentric bias in content. Luckily, when we brought this to the attention of the vendor, they agreed to work with the district to completely redesign the course to center around an anti-racist framework. We're also working with the same district to develop a systemic process to review course content of all third-party vendors that they contract with to make sure students aren't inadvertently exposed to this type of content again. And we see room for state and regional education agencies to assist districts in selecting digital tools and platforms by engaging in systemic, periodic review of these third parties' curriculum that, as I mentioned before, are not just being used to help deliver content, but are also developing the content themselves. So the next step we have found is really this partner and enhance. So ultimately, as I mentioned, the EdTech vendors must design better courses and digital tools, knowing that making content culturally aware, competent, relevant, and responsive is critical to ensuring student engagement. However, we have found that school districts and schools also have a fair amount of leverage as customers to pressure vendors into demonstrating, before they signed a contract, the ways in which they are accomplishing these goals. And this is something, a type of leverage that we've seen our district partners embed successfully within vendor contracts, and it can include continual review processes. Unfortunately, where digital tools fall short, especially in the short term, educators, in partnership with students and their families, should look for different leverage points within these systems where they can interject their own content and assignments. Educators can engage with each other in the district, teaching similar courses. We've seen them do this using collaborative online folders or weekly blog posts highlighting successful strategies and ideas that have been implemented in other classrooms in their district. We also see this as an opportunity to expand the circle and what counts as knowledge by providing opportunities for students, their families, and community members to contribute knowledge grounded in the community histories, values, and needs. This serves the dual purpose of both positioning students as independent learners and providing opportunities for educators to understand their students' cultural heritage in a deep, as opposed to merely surface level manner. Lastly, facilitate connection. This is something we've been talking about throughout the entire presentation. look for opportunities to engage students with their peers and the instructor in the learning process. Engagement in an online setting has the potential to be even more inclusive, but this requires infrastructure and support from schools to help facilitate those connections and spaces for meeting and collaboration. So for instance, one technology facilitated program that we studied created a community of learners composed of students attending schools all across the district by building in time during the class period for virtual social interaction. They also provided outlets for students to share personal experiences through class activities and assignments, and they regularly scheduled out-of-school social meetups like field trips and study sessions, which can be facilitated virtually as well as face-to-face. If you mind going to the next slide. So the use of digital tools and virtual learning can be transformational. We've seen this start to occur, but to truly engage and support the learning of all students, we really need to reflect upon, challenge, and remedy existing inequities based into the education system in traditional face-to-face settings, but particularly these tend to be magnified virtually. We need to meet students where they're at. We need to integrate and value what they're bringing to the classroom to support academic excellence, while at the same time working towards and building the capacity of students to dismantle those systems. This can be especially challenging, but also I think we can all agree that much more important in an era of crisis schooling. So the work to dismantle structural inequities within the education system is just beginning. But with a continued focus from educators, students, family, community members, and researchers, we can rebuild a new education system together based on these shared principles of equity and excellence.
So as Jennifer just talked through, we have to reimagine what K-12 education can be, especially after the forced lessons of the COVID crisis, as well as ongoing imperatives from the pandemics of racial injustice and systemic inequalities. In reimagining and rebuilding, we should act on the evidence, including the voices of those doing the work in classrooms and homes. So the voices of educators, youth, and families. Through our work, we have 4 primary takeaways or leverage points that we believe are critical to ensuring quality and equity in digital learning. We see these as laying a foundation, and these leverage points come from our research, but also align to the larger research base. First, policies, contracts, and budgets have to be structured to provide transparency and to provide resources for implementation that emphasize equity in resource allocations. Second, organizations need to have the capacity to support research and evaluation, both external evaluation and research and internal evaluation and research. So we press on research partners to ask, how are you going to go beyond a parasitic relationship with the K-12 school system? So one where your work builds the capacity of districts and schools to do research and evaluation. This is key to it being contextually and culturally responsive, let alone sustainable. Third, educators need opportunities to build capacity through targeted and continuous professional development to support implementation. So think back to our earlier points about the roles of teachers in classrooms integrating digital tools, and then think about what types of hiring and what types of professional development are needed in order to fill those roles. We need to highlight again that right now in this crisis context, the capacity of classroom teachers is stretched impossibly thin, which goes back to that first leverage point of how important policies are and budgets are in reflecting our values and in reflecting the priorities of an education system. Lastly, content and instruction must be student-centered and responsive. So again, think back to what Jennifer just described. This is increasingly important as the digital tool itself is becoming so much more central to both curriculum and instruction in a classroom. And again, think about how the other leverage points interact with this. So the importance of contracts and policies to insist on culturally relevant content from vendors, for example, or a research and evaluation structure that can assess the extent to which tools are anti-racist, or how educators are trained to help digital tools be more relevant and responsive to students' own communities and lived experiences. Slide, please. So with that, clearly these are critical issues that will stay a part of the K-12 education landscape for some time. So we look forward to continuing this work with one another and our partners, and to engage in ongoing discussions with other scholars and practitioners. And to that end, we wanted to make sure to have lots of time for discussion and questions today. So we'll open up that discussion, and we also encourage you to reach out to us beyond today as well.
Thank you, Carolyn, Annalee, and Jennifer. Thank you for a really timely presentation. I have to imagine that when you began your research, you couldn't have foreseen this sudden and just kind of widespreading across the board shift to digital. So it's just really quite timely. So there was a question that came in through, and just a reminder to folks, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section. Jennifer, this question came up when you were talking about enacting culturally relevant pedagogy and your work with the vendor. Was there a specific anti-racist framework that you all recommended to them?
So they have their own team of curriculum developers, so they're basing it on the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, but it's not a specific sort of pre-developed curricular structure, if that answers the question.
Yeah, and I'll add that we are in those more general conversations, we're really trying to push them to think about it not just as content, but that from an anti-racist and culturally relevant, responsive, culturally sustaining perspective, it's really also about building the critical consciousness of students to then push back on locally, nationally, on the systems that are creating and that are sustaining, systemic inequalities.
Yeah, I think I just would add one more thing too there, as was mentioned, the vendors have been able to take advantage of the fact that we have had a big public investment in the tools, and they do come to the districts with great deals, right, for inexpensive technologies, particular things. For example, when we saw Dallas Independent School District shift from one-to-one laptops to tablets. But what people can forget is that, especially when you're working with districts where budgets are super tight and resources low and the needs of the children are high, much bigger investment has to be made in how you make those devices work for those students and instructors and unleashing the capabilities. The purchase of the technology itself is probably the smallest, component of the cost. And so some of our guidance about early on at the contractual end, making sure that you are bringing those vendors in to take some responsibility for how well those tools will be integrated, not just saying, oh, we've got this great product and it has all these capabilities and we'll give it to you cheaply and then you can make it work, right?
So it's the content and how it actually works with the school district and the demographics as well.
And the capacities that need to be built to use them effectively, and recognizing that those supports, we've seen, one of our early visits in Dallas, Texas, there was a field trip to a nearby suburban district where you could see the amazing technology and the infrastructure that they had to implement it. And then you come back in other settings and you see that, if they don't have supportive partners, it's very hard to replicate the success of those tools in terms of creating quality learning opportunities for students if you're only buying the tool and not building all the structures around it for supports for their effective use.
Great, thank you. Can you speak a little bit about your findings at the elementary levels? And I don't know if this person is looking for comparison at the different elementary versus secondary.
So we can kind of give you a quick overview of some of the things we studied, and then the three of us can contribute in different ways. So I mentioned that, so in Dallas Independent School District, they initially started one-to-one laptops and then shifted to tablets for the elementary students. There were actually some advantages to that, right? A tablet is more portable. There are ways they could be more readily used. They were cheaper. If devices get broken, it's a lot cheaper to replace, a $50, $60 tablet than a computer that's $1,200. But we also studied this, and Jennifer might want to speak to this. We also looked, for example, at how they were used in bilingual classrooms versus traditional classrooms. And we actually saw some very interesting findings in the fact that they were working better for those bilingual students, and we were seeing greater gains with them, of course, predicated on some of those things we learned in studying relationships, like how well the learning was blended, the blended learning instructors, where instructors really having an active role in the classroom and bringing in various types of strategies for teaching. We also studied supplemental instruction at the elementary level in Milwaukee. I'll give Jennifer and Annalee a chance to jump in if they want to.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit more and talk about what we saw with emergent bilingual speakers in Dallas. And so there were a bunch of interesting findings. This was a situation where tablets were integrated within a traditional classroom setting. And there was some variability, but the one sort of key finding that we saw across everything except maybe math, where a little bit of gamification for just like practicing problems on their own was beneficial. In especially language development, we saw that what was really important was that teachers, if anything, the teacher role became more important. They might become facilitators, or they might need to be helping students understand how to use dictionary features and how to, translate back and forth based on the tools that they're using in the classroom. But that the teacher's presence was incredibly important. And so, like Carolyn was saying, that blended environment where you're blending some of the benefits, the interaction, the personalization that a teacher can provide with some of the ways that technology can sort of automate things like quick translations or it's different stories at different, really varied reading levels, just sort of like pulling that information. It was the combination of those two that when it was occurring in tandem, we saw the best results.
Annalee, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, good.
I'll kind of leave it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a question in here. Someone who's in the middle of reading the book and really appreciating the tools online and the tools in the book is asking if you have a paper or a brief with these updated ideas and tools.
So the website that we posted on the slide, I'm not sure if the slides will be shared, but has a link, research products and publications that, so you'll first see we have a whole set of research briefs. Ranging from different things to, what if you're about to purchase it? How do you, like Annalee was describing, how do you do procurement well? How, issues on blended instruction. So various technologies, various groups, various angles. There's a whole set of short research briefs, just like a couple of pages, as well as additional research papers if you can go into more in-depth for that. And I don't know if you want to add any more.
Yeah, maybe we could put that website URL in the chat with that.
Sure.
If you can, that might be helpful so folks can access it. Did you want to add to that, Jennifer? Or
I can add that to the chat. I was trying to stay on mute.
Yeah. Okay. And so this question is a follow-up to the recommendations for working with districts to build organizational capacity for evaluation. So this particular participant has a smaller district, less than 50,000 students, that may not currently have the capacity in-house beyond those folks who analyze data for a standardized test. How would you suggest that they get started to build capacity?
Sure, I can start with that. So that is a great question and really, really appreciate that. So a couple different responses. One is to think about, I would encourage school districts to also think differently about what their evaluation role is so that if there is already capacity. So for example, I think a lot of districts are pressed to just interpret evaluation in terms of standardized test scores. So my first response would be to kind of think differently around how we can evaluate. I know that school districts are under a lot of different pressure, including from federal policy, state policy, to determine how that capacity has to be used. I think it's been really interesting in the COVID context where many states suspended their standardized testing last spring. I know that the federal government is not allowing that for this year, but that it has pressed districts to also, in the absence of having standardized testing, how are we going to think about program evaluation and research? Another response to that also is, so I am in Madison, Wisconsin, and I work very closely with our local school district, along with other school districts, around program evaluation initiatives. And I will say, and so Madison's about 30,000 students, and we also work with much, much, much smaller districts. And I would say kind of co-oping evaluation across different entities that have a similar interest and that also work with the same youth, and that also are interested in similar data. So we have a lot of evaluation partners across the school districts and then community-based partners. So you can think about, like for example, United Way, or that have a lot of different programs that rely on district data, and we're all looking at the same data with the same students. So why not co-op that, co-op resources and co-op capacity as well?
I would just add that a couple of the tools that we are, so it's under the research materials and methods section of our website, a couple of the tools that we developed were like briefer tools of some of the instrumentation that we developed for more in-depth look at how implementation was happening. So for example, I mentioned we did hundreds of observations, and we would go in and we observe full classes and rate them on a range of dimensions, a tool that we kind of tested and developed over time. But we also created a short walkthrough tool that a school principal or other person in a role of trying to help lead technology implementation could take to get a sense of how well, and how often, how intensively, how effectively technology was being integrated in the classroom. So it's a brief tool expected to be used in a short, we call it a walkthrough instrument, so that kind of data can be collected. And that can be really valuable, even just getting a start as to, what should we be focusing on in our evaluation work? And it was intended to be short, brief, and accessible.
Great,
I'm going to say one other quick thing too that I meant to, is to rethink who the evaluators are. So we are, in future iterations of our work, trying to really actively engage youth as part of our evaluation and research teams, and that's something that we do a lot here in Madison as well, is have youth evaluation teams as part of the evaluation infrastructure. All right, thank you.
Can you speak to any findings related to dual classrooms where the teacher is instructing students virtually, those students that are at home, so they're learning virtually, simultaneous to a group of students present in the physical classroom? We're seeing some more cases of that in this COVID era.
So I think, that's, something we're all kind of, I think a lot of us are facing that, where it's a challenge. I know I'm doing that myself, where I have some students in the classroom and some students online. We did study one particular intervention that I think Jennifer and I could talk a little bit more, which also had this feature. This is called telepresence. And it was basically used to expand course offerings for students. So some students are present in the classroom where the teacher is, and some students are connecting in from another situation. Now that's where they're in another classroom, so it's not exactly the same, but the point is the teacher isn't present, but it brings up some similar issues that I know I am facing, and I know other teachers are facing, where you're in this hybrid instructional environment. Is, how do you build that community engagement among your learners? You worry about the kids who are online maybe feeling like they're not as equally engaged in the class or expected to be engaged. And how do you, what kind of strategies can you use to build connection across the students who are in the classroom and students who are not in the classroom getting access? And so we saw, this was in Milwaukee Public Schools, we saw the teachers making a lot of active efforts. So for example, the students had to know each other, whether they were in, online, accessing the instruction online, or with instruction in the classroom. And so they designed assignments where a student online would call on a student in the classroom, and a student classroom would call on a student online. They also had, built-in social activities for the students to get to know each other. So you still had that sense of community in the classroom rather than kind of a two-tier, learning environment. Jennifer, did you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, the other thing that I think was really helpful was everything was facilitated through their learning management system. So for instance, if they switched from a full class instruction to a group project, the teacher would have assigned people a group mate who was in an alternative setting, but everyone would be working through this platform that the teacher could comment as well and share feedback, and the students could see each other's work. So everyone was working virtually when it came to sort of collaboration, and that made it a little bit more of an even playing field. Yeah.
But I also just want to acknowledge, how hard that is to do when you are suddenly thrust into this environment and you weren't trained and prepared, right? So I know myself, I feel every time I teach in this environment, you're managing all these things, right? Like you can do breakout groups in Zoom, right? But you're trying to do that and you're trying to deliver content, you're trying to pay attention to students who are asking you questions in the chat or reaching out, or some raise their hand like this and some use the raise hand function. It's a lot of stress on the part of educators. And one of the things we saw also happen across the various settings is teachers designating either technology helpers or students to help manage some of these functions. So I know that helping someone watch the chat for you, or helping someone point out if you're missing someone in the other environment, not in your immediate environment, who's trying to get your attention. Those types of things can also help relieve some stress for the instructor in the classroom environment.
Great, thank you. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this about, in this current time where, the majority of K-12 students are either partially remote or fully remote, depending on where they are across the country. It's certainly a real opportunity for parents to get a closer bird's eye view of the tools that their children are using. And I'm curious as to, parents or caregivers or whoever is at home when the students are doing virtual learning. What I'm curious as to your thoughts of like the impact that might have on digital learning long term. Now that you talked a little bit about the partnerships with the parents and schools and teachers and all these, but there seems to me maybe their level of awareness is going to increase as a result of that. So any thoughts on what kind of impact that would have on either development of digital tools going forward or additional implementation in a post-COVID world?
Well, I'll just start really quickly by saying what I hope it really does is really emphasizes this point about the need for building capacity for the complexities of managing, digital learning initiatives. So really making sure, as Annalee mentioned this, the teachers have not just, training at the beginning of the year of how to use a tool or how to manage these environments, but ongoing professional development. And also just recognizing, we had seen over time in our study that, with, federal government initiatives like the E-rate initiative that brought faster speed broadband to districts across the nation. So that really helped the connectivity. And we literally saw that over time, the disruptions to learning being significantly reduced, which of course, as we showed, has a direct relationship to the learning that happens through them. At the same time, now we've shifted to environment in this pandemic where students may not have in their home that same kind of connectivity, or as you mentioned, may not have a caregiver prepared to do that kind of support that could happen in the classroom. So I think if this is potentially a future where we have to be prepared for, occasionally moving instruction to all online, I sure hope that school districts are thinking about how they can better create capacity, as Annalee was suggesting, not just within the schools, but thinking about the home environment and so the caregivers, the students, and drawing on their input more to understand those complexities and challenges. And I'm sure my co-authors have more to say.
Oh, go ahead, Annalee.
No, go.
I was just going to mention, I think we brought this up a fair amount, but in some of the initial data I've seen, there has been an increasing reliance on these for-profit companies who sort of deliver pre-developed packages. And I think that's something that's really important to be aware of. And as parents and caretakers and family and community are more and more aware of what students are learning, I think that there is a need to make sure that you're not just advocating that your child has the highest quality instructional content in front of you, but that if there are programs or vendors that are making money off of this but not providing quality care, that it's not provided to any student, that we really need to look at this systemically and make sure it's not just getting something out of your system, but making sure that no students are being exposed, or the vendor needs to actually work with the district and with, you know, families to make it better.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point around I'm sure we've all seen, you know, articles and stories around the whole different level of opportunity hoarding happening in the context of these crises, that absolutely plays out in then access to high quality digital products that also, you know, how do families see themselves in them, or do they at all, is an important question. And I think what your question prompts for me as well is, what does family engagement look like now that we've been in this space, this COVID space? So how do we think differently around what family engagement is when literally adults at home are co-teachers in ways that they've never been before? And so what does engagement mean? How do we define family even? You know, like the adults in youth spaces where education is happening. Again, these community-based education spaces become really important as well. And so if we're thinking about engaging those different spaces as co-educators, also, how are we going to resource that and not just yet again expect that it'll get absorbed by people who either have to or are committed to serving youth? And that comes down to policies, that comes down to contracts, that comes down to budgets.
I just want to add briefly that we literally saw heroic efforts on the part of teachers to try and bridge those gaps. As you know, Annalee mentioned, teachers taking money out of their own pockets to buy equipment that was needed, staying up, answering their students' emails, close to midnight because they want to be responsive to a student is trying that hard to keep up with their work. And so we saw, teachers just stretch to the limit and taking on those challenges because they really cared about the issues of equity, and they recognized, some of the ways in which those disparities could be worsened if they weren't doing it. But they deserve to be supported. And so, we did try some mechanisms in the course of our project, like with Milwaukee Public Schools, creating teacher fellows that could be supported with, additional resources for their roles of helping to disseminate best practices, bridge some of those gaps in capacity within their schools.
Perfect, great, thank you. I'm going to, that's all the questions that we have, which is terrific. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make any final comments before I turn it over to Mayanne to wrap up the presentation. Thank you all.
I'll just say that we really appreciate your interest in the topic. We think it's really important. It's going to continue to be important. There's so much more in the book that we could not begin to convey in this, and we've tried to structure the book so that each chapter has very specific, recommendations and strategies and tips for people for implementation. So we hope you find it valuable. That's what we intend it to be, to continue to improve equity and quality in digital learning.
Thank you, everyone. That was a really important conversation, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for everybody who joined us.
Bye, everyone.